Welcome back. And so we'll continue to record. These are videos for reviewing test number 1 from fall of 21. And this part will be for questions 8 through 10 on the slide identifications, as well as the 5 slide reaction questions. And just want to say I'm using an entirely new video recording program, so I'm just getting used to this, but I think it's working out pretty well. Okay, so once again, with slide 8, we're talking about La Meninas by Diego Velázquez. And what are some of the things? Well, first of all, you should be able to recognize that it is painting. It's an oil painting. It is a Baroque Spanish oil painting. But the main thing that we talked about with this particular painting was how it was a very unusual kind of narrative that is at play here, because it involves the audience, where there's this kind of story going on where the actual painter, Velázquez, is in the story, and he's painting a painting, a very large painting, much like the large painting we're looking at when we're standing in front of it, but we can't see what the painting is because we're only looking at the back of it. And we are standing here, and directly across from us we can see the reflection of the King and Queen of Spain. So we're kind of standing either in the position of the King and Queen of Spain, or standing in the position of their advisors, or someone, their attendant, someone standing near them. And then the young princess and her attendants are the ones who are standing here to amuse us. Like, she very much feels like the focus of the painting, but she's clearly not the focus of the painting that Velázquez is painting, because she has her back to him. So there's all this kind of complex narrative going on between these different people, but we, as the audience, are involved in it. And Velázquez, by the fact that he's making a painting, showing himself painting a painting, is kind of making this sort of meta-narrative where it's a story about the storytelling of the painting, if that makes sense. So that was one of the main things we talked about with this painting. And so we have another painting here, Raph's Medusa by Jericho. And what are some of the things we talked about? Well, we talked about how, when we were discussing shape, I used this painting as a good example of a value organized kind of meta shape, the way all the light shapes and all the dark shapes kind of group together, and it becomes this kind of undulation of all these different light shapes and dark shapes all working together. And actually, the shape organization is kind of complex, because there's this very sinuous shape organization of all these light and dark shapes of the figures, but then there are these much larger shapes, like this big, large triangle that's created, these much more kind of geometric shape organization going on in the painting at the same time. The other thing that we talked about with this painting was we talked a little bit about its narrative and what it was about, the fact that it's a kind of somewhat of a political protest painting, in that Jericho made it after hearing the news story, and he worked on it for a number of years to try to represent this event. And this news story was a bit of a scandal in France, because this particular wreck, right, this boat, the Medusa, that then wrecked at sea, and these were the only survivors, the people who were on the raft. This story, the reason why it was such a scandal was because the boat was involved in the slave trade, even though France at the time was supposed to have already been removed from the slave trade. Okay. Elegy to the Spanish Republic. So we talked about this in a number of different lectures. It came up on the lecture about figure ground as a good example of a painting that has a very strong kind of figure ground relationship, and what is positive, like the way it primarily feels like the dark marks are the positive, but you really can feel how the light marks, especially in certain areas, feel very active and very non-passive. And we also talked about it, what else did we talk about? We talked about it in terms of expression and mark making in the very first unit. And we talked about it on the lecture about representation, where I made the case that you could view this as a representational painting, precisely for the fact that he used this motif and painted basically this kind of motif and this kind of composition of this motif over and over again and kept calling it Elegy to the Spanish Republic. And he did it in small studies, and ink studies, and prints, and in large paintings, some in house paint, some in other materials. He did it over and over again, and always called it Elegy to the Spanish Republic. And so my point is that even if we can't quite figure out how this represents the death of that movement, right, and the victory of fascism over democracy, for Robert Motherwell, it definitely represented that. Okay, on to the slide reaction questions. So one of the things you might have noticed is that even though I said on the slide reaction questions that some of them might be completely unknown to you, every single one of them had appeared in at least one of my lectures. So if you'd gone back and reviewed them, and a few of them actually appeared in the extra credit study guide. So anyway, Jeff Koons here, and we talked about this piece in a number of places. So remember, first off, when you're doing the slide reaction, the very first question you should ask yourself is, do I know what media this is? And in this case, this piece is a form of sculpture, and that's one of the places where we talked about it. We talked about it in terms of how surface relates to sculptures. Different surfaces create different senses of connection with a form. And this piece is cast steel, I think. It's either cast steel or cast aluminum. But it's designed to look like it's an inflatable. So it has this kind of weird dichotomy between looking like something really light and flimsy, but then actually being something very solid and heavy. It is an example of cast, right? So indirect sculpture, and it's an example of freestanding and in the round sculpture. So this piece by Bronzino is a drawing, and I think this is, when we get to test 3, when we get to the printmaking unit, probably the biggest thing that students will struggle with is telling the difference between what's a drawing and what is a print. In this case, we didn't see any prints in our, we didn't talk about any printmaking, and so there were no prints on the test. And this is an example of a drawing. So the question you might want to ask yourself is, how would I know it's a drawing? And I would give you, well, like, number 1, it's monochromatic, right? So it just has one color. Number 2, the particular color is this kind of iron oxide red, which is kind of a giveaway because red chalk is one of the most common drawing tools, along with just black charcoal and black Conte. So, and in fact today, red Conte, which is just another form of red chalk, is a very, very common drawing tool. So it's in red, and you can also tell that like it's on a white or a light tone, right, like a piece of paper, and then all the changes of color and value all have to do with how much pressure, how much saturation. So, and then another thing you can see is that it is primarily a line work, right? It's mostly linear, and that a lot of the tone follows also this kind of like linear cross contour lines, like if you look up here. So that's a little bit of a giveaway also that it's a drawing. This is a Renaissance work, but you may not have known that, but you probably would be able to tell that, you would be able to note that it was monochromatic. You would be able to note that, I think you should be able to tell that it's a drawing. And you might also notice up here there's a signature, but it's not a signature. It says Correggio, but you may notice that the work is actually done by Bronzino, and you may wonder, well, what does that mean? Well, when it was owned by a particular collector, I don't know, a couple of 100 years ago or so, it was assumed that it was a Correggio, and so the person put the name Correggio on there. But in fact, that is a misattribution. It is, in fact, a Bronzino. And I've thought it was a Correggio drawing for most of my life, and was kind of shaken to find out that I was wrong, and it is, in fact, a Bronzino drawing. But, the Met did all the research, and they're pretty darn confident. Okay. You could also note something about cross-contour line and about building up value through repetition of line, as well as building up value through change of line weight. Okay. Guernica by Pablo Picasso we talked about this in a number of instances. We haven't actually got to the Art and Power lecture, which is one of the main places where we will talk about this. First thing to note is that it is a painting, although it's a little bit hard to tell as a painting because it's so linear. You might think it was a print. In fact, he did do a print version of this, or you might think that it was a drawing. You can tell in some of these places if you look at the way the values are organized here, or the surface, kind of the texturalness of the surface. You can see some clues that it actually is a painting because you can kind of see layers of light color over the top of dark colors. Also, you can kind of tell that it's not wholly monochromatic because there's a warm and cool going on. Some of the grays are cooler, almost more kind of purplish, and a lot of the grays are more warm, almost brownish. But okay, so it's monochromatic mostly. It is a painting, and what we will learn in the next lecture is that it's a painting about a particular horrific event that happened in the Spanish Civil War, once again relating to the Elegy for the Spanish Republic, and a particular village was bombed by the Axis powers, the Francoists, using planes from either fascist Italy or from Nazi Germany, and the village was almost completely destroyed. And this is a kind of a representation of the loss. Okay, so you may remember this work when we talked about narrative art. We'll see this one again when we get to the art medium of illustration, and we'll talk about in what way is illustration its own separate medium. So what is the material here? A lot of people were confused. If you said it was a drawing, I gave you points. If you said it was a painting, I gave you points because it's kind of both. It is a line drawing. He's using pen and ink, but it's also watercolor. And and it's on paper. So is it a drawing? Is it a painting? Is it an illustration? Well, I guess in a way it's kind of all of those. And so it's a work for a book. Many of you may know the book, right? Where the Wild Things Are. And what else could you say about it besides it being an illustration, besides it being a drawing? You could say, like many drawings, that it builds up value through repetition of line, right? As well as some change of line weight. What else? That it is from a children's book. And we talked about it because of the fact that children's book illustration is one of the examples of narrative art where I pointed out that because children's book illustration uses so few words, the images have to do so much of the work. And in this case, this particular case, if you remember the book, this is a full page spread. There are no words whatsoever. The image does all the work for it. Okay, so what can we say here? This is an amphora. It's black figure, so it's Greek ceramics. And I put all the information here just in case, but you probably would not have remembered any of that. I did not tell you to study this piece, but you would be able to note that it is an amphora. It's a pan-Hellenic amphora, so it's like a prize for an athletic victory, and in fact it shows the athletic competition that it was a prize for. It's black figure, right? The figures are in black, and all the line work is done by scratched in. And what else can we say? Well, you could talk a little bit about what you know about black figure, that the negative space, that red color is the color of the clay itself, whereas the black is the color of a black slip that is painted over the red clay. And you could just define what an amphora is, right? Wide shoulders, narrow neck, handles that connect from the shoulder to the neck, narrow feet. There you go. Okay, that's the end of part 2. In the next section, I'm going to talk about the 2 slide comparison questions, and then after that, probably tomorrow, I will do videos on the short answer questions. Okay, thank you very much.